Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hot Topic Cafe, Open Choice at CREC. My name is Carla Cruz. I'm the Family Engagement Specialist for Open Choice. I'm going to allow my colleague, Tyrone Waterman, to introduce himself as well.
Good evening, everybody. I am Tyrone Waterman, Family Engagement Specialist with CREC Open Choice.
And I'm going to now pass it on to Tanisa. Tanisa is our presenter. She will share her role in the Open Choice office and our team, and she will lead today's presentation. So I hope you enjoy it. And we are going to ask that if you have any questions in regards to today's presentation, so please wait until the end of the presentation, and we'll open up the floor for some Q&A. Tanisa?
Good evening. I'm Tanisa Turnbaugh. I'm the Open Choice Behavior Support Specialist. I'm a behavior analyst, and I assist school districts, all of the Open Choice partnering districts, and I help students in schools how to best access education. And so one of the ways that this happens is through special education. And so we wanted to share a little bit today about what special education is and the role of the parent in that process, and also parent rights. And we wanted to also give parents an opportunity at the end if they had questions to address those. And also know that if you're not comfortable sharing personal information, that you can always contact the Open Choice office and we can have private consult with you outside of this forum. So with that, let's get started. So this presentation is part of the Open Choice Peak series. So that's Parents Empowered Through Advocacy and Knowledge. And today, as I said, we're focusing on supporting your child and that preparing for the special education process and PPT meetings. So first, what is special education? And so what it actually is a legal framework that provides a modified curriculum, individualized instruction, and related services for students identified with a disability. I've identified the disability categories that fall under special education. Now, there may be some students that have an identified disability but don't qualify or not eligible for special ed. They typically at that point though are eligible for a Section 504 plan, which we will cover in a different session. But special education, these are the categories typically that once a child is identified with a disability, the IEP would then specify which one of these to kind of classify that under. And so with that, we'll talk about what a referral is. And so this is the first part. So referrals happen really at any grade level. It can happen, kind of in kindergarten, first grade. Schools and parents might see that there might be a need for special education. Sometimes kids, and one of the things that we'll talk about, it doesn't start to have an adverse effect on their education until later. And so this might be something that parents of third and fourth graders are going through. It can happen up in middle school and high school, but typically it happens, most likely the referral happens somewhere in elementary. And so what this means, what the referral is it is a formal request for the evaluation of a student. This could be a student that already has a medical diagnosis with a disability, such as ADHD or autism, other health impairments. And so the evaluation, though, can happen for kids that don't have a medical diagnosis. Maybe the team is looking at a learning disability or sort of an emotional need. And so this really is the parent and the school's first step for saying, there's something going on. We want to know more about it. Let's evaluate the student for special ed eligibility. And so who can make the referral. Throughout this presentation, I've highlighted in yellow where it really highlights a parent's role, a parent's rights. And you'll see that there's a lot of yellow in this presentation. And it's really important to understand as a parent that you are a central figure to this PPT team, to this planning and placement team. Yes, often there are large teams of people. We'll talk about why in just a bit. And so sometimes as a parent, you might feel like you're just this one person, but your perspective and your role on the team is just as important as any other professional sitting at that table or now in the Zoom meeting. So who can make a referral? So a parent, a guardian can make the referral. You can ask the school specifically for a referral to special education. So that can be, there will be a form then that you would be asked to fill out, but you absolutely as a parent have that right to request that initial evaluation. School personnel, they also can make a referral. And then an outside agency, like a professional agency, for instance, open choice figure to this PPT team, to this planning and placement team. Yes, often there are large teams of people. We'll talk about why in just a bit. And so sometimes as a parent, you might feel like you're just this one person, but your perspective and your role on the team is just as important as any other professional sitting at that table or now in the Zoom meeting. So who can make a referral? So a parent, a guardian can make the referral. You can ask the school specifically for a referral to special education. So that can be, there will be a form then that you would be asked to fill out, but you absolutely as a parent have that right to request that initial evaluation. School personnel, they also can make a referral. And then an outside agency, like a professional agency, for instance, open choice staff could on your behalf with parental permission. So anyone that's not the parent or school has to have parent permission to make that referral. And sometimes the student, if they're 18 years old, they can represent themselves and request an evaluation for their education. And so, you know, typically it's when a referral is made. So when and why does this tend to happen? So typically what you're going to find is a student that's not accessing education with the supports that are already typically provided to students in general ed classrooms. So these are students that need significant more extra adult support with their academics or their behavior. They struggle to attend to instruction. And now there's always, I mean, developmentally children are on the spectrum, you know, for sort of how well they attend and follow directions. But this really is for students that aren't responding to the typical redirections that happen within the classroom, the typical extra adult support that is there. They need more and they need it more consistently. When that happens over time, that might be a good time to take a look at thinking about the special ed process. And we did in our first series, we talked about, though, and I wanted to make note of it, the SRBI process. And so that process is designed to kind of catch kids before special education. So if you feel that maybe your student, you're not sure maybe if they should be referred or not, check in and make, you know, double check with the team if they've tried what's called SRBI, and definitely check out our video on that to explain it a little bit more. Because this is certainly after typically when that process has been exhausted and progress is not being shown. So outside of that, you would also look for maybe there's children that have been suspended repeatedly for certain behavior. And it can happen for attendance as well. This mechanism could kick in for students with chronic attendance issues. And so these are when you would make a referral. And just keep in mind, it is your right as well to make that referral if the school, even if they've been in SRBI, you at any point as the parent can ask for this evaluation. So once the referral happens, pretty quickly, a planning and placement team, so that this is the PPT, this is when that team is developed. And so in the event that you weren't the one that made the referral, you will receive a written notice of the referral. Most likely this would have been stemming from conversations with you. So this isn't something that's necessarily going to come out of nowhere. But if you don't, then you will get that written notice of referral, and you'll be asked to attend the meeting. And so a parent has a choice at this point. One, you can consent. So if the parent consents, then the initial PPT, sometimes it's called a PPT1, will be conducted to take a look at the data from the SRBI or the classroom teacher, sort of anything that's kind of been going on, and the team will review that. Then from there, they will decide, and when I say they, I mean you as well as part of that team, what additional evaluations need to occur to get a comprehensive evaluation of your child. And so this might be academic assessments. There might be some behavior assessments. You might see cognitive, OT, so occupational therapy, speech and language. Kind of all of these professionals convene and talk about, I would assess this. Does the team think this would be helpful? I would assess this. And so then you decide there which assessments are needed to give all of the information needed to support your child. And so sometimes this is where an initial diagnosis may be found, particularly for learning disabilities coming out of academic data and that SRBI data. You might get a cognitive that might diagnose some other things. And so, and they're also looking at this point to get a present level of performance, sort of where is the child's progress right now. And so this is what happens at the PPT1. If you do not consent, you can choose to not consent. And so from there, what that means, it's one thing to consider when you don't consent, though, is that sort of the special ed process is a legal document that is binding for saying my child needs this to access their education. These are the modifications to the curriculum, and these are the extra services that they need to be successful. You can choose to say no, but you do then waive sort of the ability to be flexible with what services are provided your child and what modifications to the curriculum may be necessary. And by modification to curriculum, what that means is sometimes the general education curriculum, what's being presented in the classroom, is challenging for a student with a disability, learning disabilities, even behavior, kind of disorders, because accessing that curriculum, even if they can do it in one-to-one situations and settings, the whole group setting can be super tricky for them. And so that's one way that special ed sort of helps mediate that. So just to go back to, if you do not consent, it does become more difficult for the school to provide assistance to your child legally at that point. And so you can still ask if you deny for a reevaluation, if it's a 3-year eval, which we'll talk about in a bit. And so here, what the school would do, they can choose something, and you'll hear this come up a couple times. It's called due process, and it's mediation. So what this means is the state of Connecticut, the Board of Education would assign a mediator and a hearing officer. And so from there, they help work out these sort of disagreements. So if you do not consent, the school has that option to go through due process and mediation. And then they also can choose at this point, though, not to not pursue further evaluation, in sort of a wait and see approach, see if SRBI doesn't make some sort of progress or not. And sometimes a parent may make a referral and the school doesn't agree. At that point, you can also look to contact the state and pursue due process at that point as well. due process, is one of those things that nobody necessarily wants to go through, but it can be a very helpful mechanism in sort of working out these disagreements. They're not common. It's not something that happens all the time, but it is there as a support. Let's see. So the roles. So if you've been to a PPT meeting, you will see that there are a number of individuals at the table, some of which work every day with your child, some that maybe see weekly, and some maybe only at these meetings. And there's a reason for that, and that is because the law states that there are certain individuals that must be present at a PPT. And so the people on the team are parents, and when appropriate, the student. So sometimes, particularly as the student gets older, they're invited to sit on their PPT teams. The regular education, if they're in a regular ed classroom, then in middle school and older grades, when there tends to be more than one of those for different subjects, one is identified to come to the meeting. A special educator. And so if the student is, sometimes there will be a special educator, but there might be someone else on the team that is called a service coordinator or a case manager. Sometimes a special educator serves both those roles, somebody that implements special education in like academics, and they are also the case manager. Sometimes it's a social worker or a psychologist or another school personnel that might be the service coordinator or case manager, but they are two different roles, sometimes shared by one person, if that wasn't confusing. Let's see, a pupil services staff. So there will be a social worker or a psychologist on the team. Then there's somebody called the LEA. And so this is the local educational agency. And this is typically a principal, an assistant principal, or somebody from central office. And so this is the person that is knowledgeable of general education, specialized instruction, and they also know about resources and funds available, meaning, like what the school can provide, what they may need to seek out in other places for further supports. And so these are like the logistics type people. And then someone who can interpret evaluations. Usually this is the special educator or a regular educator, but there has to be somebody that can interpret those evaluations once they happen. And then the parent and the school can invite any other person to the meeting. It's typically those outside agency providers that would serve in this sort of role. And this is if they have knowledge and expertise that would benefit the student. It's also important to note that a parent can invite anyone to a meeting. They don't have to necessarily be an expert in any field or have any sort of credential. It can be your own parent. It can be a friend. It can be anybody that you would like to support you in that meeting. And you would just have to invite them. You don't necessarily have to do anything formal to do that. Sometimes letting the school know that you'll be inviting someone else, it's helpful, just particularly when we're in person again, and maybe just extra seats and considering the room size. But you can invite anybody to that you would like to these meetings. If one of the PPT members are absent from a meeting, they can't attend. If you agree as the parent, then they cannot be present. Usually this happens only if their particular service is not going to be discussed, or if they have, usually they'll write an update or a progress note and give that as input to the team. If you really want that person there, if it's necessary for you to have that person there to be able to talk with them in the context of that meeting, you can insist that they be present, and then the meeting would have to be rescheduled. But you do have that choice. So when to hold a PPT. So the PPTs, and we will be discussing at length what the actual IEP, the individualized education plan, is, and all of its pieces and parts at a later session, just because that one really requires a lot of time to really digest. But Once one is written, happens after the referral, after the evaluation comes back and eligibility has been established, then the IEP is created. And so that's that legal document. So, but that document has to be reviewed annually. That's the minimum requirement though. So minimally you would meet once a year as that whole PPT team. Then once there is eligibility, the team must be reconvened triannually, so every 3 years. And what happens is the team reevaluates eligibility. Is the child still eligible for special education? Have they made enough progress that now maybe they move to a 504, or maybe they're discharged from special ed completely? But that happens every 3 years minimally. That doesn't mean that these meetings don't happen more often. These are just the minimum requirements. Anytime that IEP is going to be changed, so changes to the goals, to the objectives, services, accommodations, or placement, anytime that happens, a PPT meeting should be convened to talk about that. Sometimes minor changes might be made. For instance, maybe an objective is changing, or a service provider recommends that they want to increase their time or decrease their time. Sometimes you may be asked as the parent, or asked if you would like to kind of waive the meeting part and sign a form that would allow the IEP to be amended without that meeting. You can absolutely insist, though, to have that meeting if a change to the IEP is being made, even if somebody has asked you to just allow an amendment. Just know that you have the right to insist on a meeting if you'd like. You should receive a written notice 5 days prior to a PPT meeting, and that notice should be in your dominant language. Sometimes emergency PPT meetings are held and you will be asked to waive this right. That is at your discretion. You can choose to keep the 5-day wait, or you can choose to waive it. Typically, this has to do with safety issues and things like that, or if a student is really struggling and the team wants to convene to make a change to the IEP within a 5-day time period. Let's see. So then the meeting must be scheduled at a mutually agreed upon time and place. So if it's not convenient for you, or if you're just given a date and time, which sometimes happen, it's sort of like the start of here's the dates that were available. Does this work for you? If it's not, remember, you can request to have that rescheduled. You can request to have it like Zoom, if that would work better for you, or a conference call if Zoom it doesn't work for you. And so, but that you can ask for a different day and time. Make sure that you really advocate for yourself so that you can be fully present at this meeting. You don't want to necessarily be rushed or kind of stressed about getting to it. And so it should be mutually agreed upon. There are cases where a school has to, and remember, the school is also kind of up against these legal timeframes. And so if they've said that, the annual meeting is coming up and things like that, then they may have to have a meeting. And if they repeatedly attempt to contact a parent by phone, by email, by papers in a backpack, they can hold the meeting without you. That this doesn't happen often. This happens in very, specific cases, but they will document their attempts, to, and that, perhaps maybe they had the wrong phone number. You had a phone number disconnected, or your email, they were going to the junk folder and you never knew it. So this can be helpful, the fact that they document their attempts, but they can have one without you. Let's see. There are a few times when they need actual written consent and not just formal consent from you to follow through with certain parts of this process. And so when this is going to happen is going to be at that initial referral. This is your opportunities to say yes or no through that written consent. And we talked about what happens if you say no, and if you say yes. The second time that happens is after those initial evaluations are done. Then there's going to be an eligibility meeting. And what this is the review of the evaluations. And then the team, which we'll talk about in a bit, will say yes or no, the student is eligible for education, special education. So at this point, that is when you also have to give written consent. So if at the beginning you were hesitant with the special education process, you can consent for the evaluations, hear how the assessments come back, and you have a choice there at the end to say, yes, I agree that they're eligible and should have special education, or no, I don't feel that I would like to enter my child into special education at this time. And so the third time has to do with if the team decides that the student's needs are better met in a private placement, an alternative program, or sometimes it's a completely different school. They need written consent prior to that placement. If you decline that placement, then this might be another time that they might pursue the due process route. Usually though, by this point, teams have been together a while. In very rare cases is this right out of the box at the start of a special ed service. But so, I mean, at this point, you should know the team pretty well. This should be something that you were aware of as coming as an option. But just know this is another time that you have the right as a parent to kind of pump the brakes if you're uncomfortable. And then the fourth time that you will need to provide written consent is that every 3-year reeval. And so you have to consent at that point for assessment, and again for keeping them in special ed. For the triennial review, sometimes schools will choose to just do a record review, and that's with your input. A record review is, we know this student really well. We're not questioning the diagnosis. Let's not put the child through more assessment. We have what we need to continue to make progress. And so it might just be a simple meeting that says, yes, we'll review the current records. And then in the reeval stage, if they don't get written consent and you do not respond with your decision, they can proceed with certain reevaluations. Just know that that is sort of there as well. So then the evaluation for eligibility. So what might come out of here, it's important that this evaluation is comprehensive. It has to take a look at all of the pertinent parts of the child. And so you might see formal and informal observations conducted by service providers and educators. You might see checklists and interviews, which you will be asked to complete portions of. Maybe there's an outside agency that has maybe served the child before, and so they might also be looking for checklists and interviews. They'll look at the classroom work and assignments. If your child is in birth to 3, they'll take a look at any of those records, and then they'll do an assortment of standardized tests. And this is highly individualized. There is no cut. These are the tests that will be done. That's part of that PPT, that first team, is the team discusses all of the assessments. And you can choose to consent to some and maybe not to others. That's at your discretion. And so when this happens, the evaluation must be completed and that IEP document developed within 45 school days from the date of that written referral consent. And so that happens. It can seem like a long time, but it's thoughtful in the sense that, some of these evaluations take a lot of the child's time. And so we wouldn't necessarily want to bombard them with a litany of assessments. kind of much sooner than that. And so let's see. I think we talked about the triennial as well. And just so sometimes you might need additional assessments. This doesn't mean that you won't have assessments throughout the IEP process. Sometimes outside of, within the year, maybe a different professional says, hey, I'd really like to do this assessment. They would come back to you for consent for that as well. So it doesn't mean that this is the only chance for formal assessment and evaluation. And so here are some basic rights that parents have at a PPT meeting. You are always offered what are called procedural safeguards. If you take each copy, you will have a giant stack at the end of your child's career, student career, if they are in special ed the whole time. You can decline them if you don't want another copy. But just know it is something that they have to offer you at the beginning of a meeting. And it's helpful, and make sure that you read through that document. And there is another called the Parents Guide that puts it a little bit in more easier to read terms. So what it kind of summarizes though is your right at a PPT meeting is that you have the right to understand what's being provided to your child. You have the right to have an interpreter there if your primary language is not English. You have the right for longer meeting times. If there's a litany of assessments and you really want to understand all of the details, and you haven't had an opportunity, some providers will actually ask to meet with you before these meetings to go over their reports. But in the event that doesn't happen and you really want to understand, it's okay to ask for more time for a meeting. It's okay to ask for multiple meetings to make sure that you understand everything being presented, particularly when it pertains to that initial eval and that eligibility and the IEP development. You should feel like an informed member of that team. So during the meeting, if for instance you have internet connection issues and you miss some pieces and you feel like you didn't get to really hear everything, you can ask to reschedule it. Yes, there are legal timelines that they're up against, but there is flexibility in terms of making sure that you're available and fully present and able to understand everything. You also have the right to ask for an alternative means. Right now during the pandemic, everybody's on Zoom. There will come a time where maybe we turn back to more in-person meetings, and maybe those work better for you. But make sure that you advocate for the best way for you to attend a meeting. Sometimes that is Zoom, even when everybody is back in person. You can still choose to be asked to be included by Zoom. You can ask to tape record a meeting. Everybody though has to be informed if they're going to be taped, and kind of give their general understanding that that's going to happen. If the district tapes the meeting, it becomes a student record. But so just know, you can tape record a meeting and, use it to just rehear pieces, especially if there's a lot of information being presented. And then it said, and then at your expense, if for instance, you wanted to bring in another professional for another perspective, the school wouldn't necessarily pay for that person to attend in that capacity, but you can. And you can also make sure you can have advocates, you can have, we had mentioned friends, but just know that your right is to have whoever at the table that you feel comfortable having on your behalf. And so in determining what makes a student eligible is after that 45-day evaluation period, and you get the written copies of the results, there's 3 criteria that the team then sits down, they look at all the results and they say, okay, does this student meet these 3 things? And these 3 criteria is 1, is it a disability within the disability categories that we showed at the beginning? 2, does that disability have an adverse effect on their education? And so if the answer to this is no, meaning yes, they have a disability, but no, they're doing okay, they're accessing the curriculum and they're doing well, then that's where the team might then start to discuss a section 504, which looks for accommodations for a student, not necessarily modifying their program, modifying their curriculum. But so there has to be an adverse effect, meaning they have to show some deficits, some kind of significant delays in order for special education to kick in. And then the third is to mitigate the adverse effect on the education. Does it require special education and related services? And so that's where then the team would say, yes, they would need a special educator to meet with them in one-to-one or small group. They need speech and language, or they need occupational therapy, physical therapy, maybe some behavior therapy. And so if the team agrees that all three of these gates are met, then the student is eligible. In the event that there was an evaluation done, and maybe the results didn't sit right with you, they didn't seem to really understand your child in that assessment, and you thought that maybe you might like a second opinion, you can request an independent education evaluation. And this can be from a qualified professional. In fact, it has to be from somebody with the same credentials that the school had used for that initial evaluation. And it has to be able to be done within the school setting. And so the school can agree to pay. In most cases, they will agree to pay for this second opinion. And they will even provide you a list of independent evaluators. So that does not mean that you have to choose from that list. But if you don't know maybe who else to use, they can say, well, here are some other providers and some professionals that would do that evaluation. And then sometimes, and this is just in the law, it's not that this happens often, the school may say, no, we don't need an independent eval. Then they might go to due process. So that mechanism is there. And then what happens then is that the parent would, if they still wanted that evaluation to give to the team, then it would have to be at the parent's expense. And then the note here on these independent evaluations is that the districts have to consider the results, but it doesn't mean that they have to take the recommendations for services and things that are provided. Typically, when I've seen these done, it's a very collaborative, and districts welcome the extra information. But typically schools do a pretty good job. They have established evaluators that do these types of assessments often, but just know that this is there for you if you would like. And so then we'll just go over sort of what an IEP is. And so this is pretty brief. Like I said, we're going to go into this a little bit more in depth in another session, but the IEP is that written document. If your child's already in special education, you would have seen this. It's several pages, and it has all sorts of pieces and parts. It is a legal document. What is in there is legally binding to be done. And anytime a revision is done to this, you should get a copy within 5 days. But the main parts of this IEP, what you'll see are present levels of performance. And so that's what that information from the assessments and evaluation have. Measurable goals, which should be determined based off of the present levels of performance. And then those goals should be broken down into shorter term instructional objectives. And so that piece is really important, that the goals and objectives are what the modified curriculum kind of is. And so it shows what a good portion of your child's time will be focused on while they're in school. It does not mean that that's all they learn and that that's all that's being focused on, but it does mean this is where the team feels they need the most support. And so then you would have the evaluation and performance criteria. So how will the team know if progress is being made? So that's going to be in the how are they going to measure those goals and objectives? And then the modifications and accommodations. These listed in the IEP are applicable to not just the general education curriculum, but any extracurricular activities offered by the school and any school-wide testing. And so this isn't just in the classroom. This goes for sports and theater and music and sort of anything else that your child might be interested in that the school offers, but they need the similar extra support that they get in the school. Those modifications and accommodations apply to all of these activities. Then you'll see special education and related services. And so this is the team has decided these are the goals and objectives, and then how. So the related services and special education pieces, the how the school's going to do that. Are they going to see a special educator once or multiple times a week? Are they going to receive their instruction in a special education classroom? What related services? Related services is occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language, behavior, sometimes social work and psychology, depending on whatever the team had decided. But that is its own separate part. And then you'll see the instructional settings. So where are these services going to happen? And then the providers. So the who, the what credentials, who's going to implement these services. Kind of all of, I think most of the related services have like assistants in their profession. Sometimes they may say that services will be given by the assistants and X amount of sessions will be given by the provider. And so pay attention to those because those are all outlined in there. Then when a child hits 15, the team will start talking about transition services. And this is when people kind of take a forward thinking approach and what are the plans for the child? What are the child's plans for the child after high school? And what needs to happen in high school to get them prepared for their step out into the world. And so those are the parts of that. And then as the final piece I just wanted to make note is sometimes discipline, of students in special education comes up. And so this is typically, for problem behavior that is dangerous to themselves, to others. And so you might have a child that is already eligible for special ed and they are suspended for something. It's important to know that if during that suspension, a non-disabled peer would not receive services, then your child may not receive their special ed services during the suspension. And this counts to up to 10 consecutive days. If it is more than 10 days, something called a manifestation determination has to be made. And so this is when the team convenes and they take a look at, one, is a change of placement needed? Is the behavior that resulted in the suspension something that is a result of the disability? And if so, is a change of placement needed to consider to help with that disability if it's gotten to a point where safety is an issue? And so if it seems like a pattern of misconduct has developed and further supports are needed, and then that's when they might take a look at that. And so it's important to know that this is to make sure that your child is getting FAPE, and what that is, free and appropriate public education. So if your child has a disability and they're not making progress in the classroom, given all of these supports, if the team doesn't consider other placements, then they might be denying your child that free and appropriate public education. And then this is also where you might hear about a functional behavior assessment if it wasn't already part of one of the original evals. And so that's an FBA. And then that's where they would take a look at, is there other behavioral interventions that can be done to support the student in the school? And so If though through this it is found that the school maybe not be implementing the IEP as written or as efficiently as written, then a alternative change of placement cannot be recommended. It has to make sure that the IEP is being implemented first, unless it has to do with weapons, drugs, and serious bodily injury. And so that sort of is, let me stop sharing now. But that is the general kind of overview for that initial referral eligibility process.
Thank you, Tanisa. Well, real knowledge information. I'm going to open up the floor right now for any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions about the presentation to Tanisa, or if you feel you want to just put it in the chat, we'll freely also read those questions for you. Any questions that you may have right now about our presentation tonight? I know it was a lot of information.
And if not, I just want to offer again, I think I said it at the beginning, know that you can always ask for a private consult with one of the resource specialists or myself at Open Choice if something comes up.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to ask Tyrone to put our emails in the chat, our contact information. Again, this presentation has been recorded and it will be shared in our weekly memo that goes out every Sunday evening. So if you have not been receiving the Open Choice Family Network memo, which is full of resources, full of trainings, full of resources in regards to COVID and in agencies, please let us know. Put your email in the chat and we will make sure that your email is updated in our system so that you are able to receive all this information that goes out every single week on the Sunday evening, just to get your week started with plenty of resources that our Open Choice program provides for all our Open Choice families. Thank you for joining us on today's session. Again, this was a quick part 2 of session of 4 many sessions that we're going to be having at the end of this year, but also in our next school year. So you just were part of the supporting your child with special education needs through advocacy and preparation. And this focused a lot on PPT preparation. But please, as Tanisa mentioned, we will have another session that we will focus on IEP directly. More information for you. Thank you for joining us, and you guys have a good evening.